Record, and we'll get going. So this is just a little bit about my company Trinity, really just as context for those of you on the call, and more importantly, really as context for the insights that I'm going to share over the next little while. We've spent a lot of the last 6 or 7 years talking to CEOs, procurement people, senior decision makers in organizations on behalf of B2B vendors. And we do this for a very specific reason. We do this to find out why they made their buying decisions. And so a lot of the learnings and insights from those conversations, I'm going to be sort of sharing aspects of that today, or interpreting that to really explain why some of the deals that we work on do go quiet, because it tends to be one of the biggest frustrations for all of us. So let's dive in. This is, you know, kind of a jumping off point. Let's dive in, and we'll sort of talk about this topic in a little bit more detail. Why do deals really go quiet? So this is just a couple, in my experience, a couple of reasons. So prospects feeling under undue pressure. You know that way, if you walk into a shop and someone says to you, "Oh, can I help you?" And you say, "No, I'm just browsing." Well, there's a similar thing which happens with the early stage of the sales cycle, where we don't want to be pushed and pressured and dragged kicking and screaming through your stages of your sales process. We actually want to feel like we have some level of control and autonomy. So that's one of the reasons that we see pretty frequently. Another one, unfortunately, is that there just isn't really a compelling event. You know, they're kicking the tires, they're having an explore, they're doing some research, but the reality is there isn't a burning platform inside their business. There isn't a problem they're desperately trying to solve. And as a result, we're just trying to really, create a need that isn't actually there. Another reason we see for deals going quiet is that there's no one internally that's our champion or that's owning it for us. There's no one that's really taking ownership either of the sale or the activity, or for that matter, just of the engagement with us. And so if you don't have that level of internal sponsorship, then no one really cares necessarily enough to respond to you. So that's one that we'll hear all too often. The other thing is sometimes, and this kind of connects back to point number one as well, we're just too early in the process. So what's really happening in that scenario is they're doing their early due diligence. Maybe they're doing some research, they've downloaded a white paper, they've gone to our website, and we reach out because that's the thing to do. We want to respond in a timely fashion, but it's actually too early at that point for them to have the conversation. And so it's effectively just a mechanism for them to say, right, leave us alone, let us do our own due diligence, and in good time we'll engage with you. And I think it's really, really important that we're respectful of that, because if we aren't, what we potentially can do is create a very poor first impression. We haven't earned the right. This is an interesting one, in the sense that a lot of the customers that we talk to about their engagements with salespeople and vendors, they just don't feel that the salespeople have done enough, or the vendors have done enough to actually earn the right to progress. So, the quality of our initial marketing and the quality of our initial content wasn't great, or maybe we had an initial discovery call and we didn't add much value, or maybe we had an initial meeting and they didn't feel that they could progress with us. Now, sometimes it's difficult for people to give us that feedback. So what they do is just disappear into the ether and we never hear from them again, which is very, very frustrating, obviously, for us. But equally, it's just the path of least resistance for customers. And there's a whole lot of things which over the course of the next 45 minutes I'll talk about in terms of mechanisms to try and help avoid these situations. Another one that, too often happens as well is the fact that they're simply moving forward with the competition. Now, that doesn't mean they won't re-engage with us at some point if the conversations they're having with the competition don't eventuate or don't turn into something tangible. So they're keeping us in the wings, but for all intents and purposes, we're just on the back burner. We're the default position if they can't get to an outcome with the competitor they're talking to. Again, that's an extremely frustrating position for us to be in, but there's a whole lot of little things that we can do to, maybe test and improve our position. Not talking to the right person. Look, this is kind of an obvious one, but sometimes where this one gets tricky is that people actually pretend to be the right person. So they tell us that, yes, absolutely, I'm running this process. Yes, absolutely, I have access to budget. Yes, absolutely, I can make this decision. And maybe they think they can, or maybe they're fooling themselves. But more often than not, what that does is it creates a situation where we get single-threaded talking to one individual in an organization whilst the actual decision-making process is happening around them. It's a tricky position to be in, but one that we have to do everything in our power to avoid, because otherwise, deals go down and we don't even know what's happening. And then the last one, which is pretty frustrating in my role to hear this, and I hear it more often than I care to say, is, we did something wrong, we did something unprofessional, or we did something unethical at some step in the process, and as a result, the customer just stepped back completely. Now, you wouldn't think that would happen too often, but so much of the decision-making criteria that we hear when we talk to senior leaders about why they went with one organization and not with another organization speaks to exactly this topic. They were unprofessional. They weren't responsive. The quality of their responses was poor. They tried to step in during our probity process. They put in a non-competing bid, or a non a bid that didn't adhere to our criteria. We have to be super, super careful, because we can be squeaky clean in all these other areas, and this one criteria can kill a deal forever. And we had an example just recently where exactly that happened. A bid outside of the probity process was put in by a vendor, and the whole thing was discounted. But not only that, the vendor was discounted as well. So what I'd like to do now for a moment is I actually want to ask you guys a quick question. So if you can just find the little chat box here in the platform, and just answer this question for me. Just think back to a deal that you've done, or a deal that you're working on maybe at the moment, and just your interpretation of why you think that deal went quiet. So if you just pop that into the chat box, I'll see it, no one else will see it, and then I'll maybe share some of the more interesting or surprising reasons with you. So obviously people looking for the chat box at the moment. Okay, so we have one coming through. I didn't make it clear what the next steps were. I came across as pushy and arrogant. Good for you actually owning up to that. Not good for you as being pushy or arrogant, but good for you owning up to that. Because again, we did a review for a client recently on a very, very significant, tens of millions of dollars transaction. And the feedback from the client was a whole lot of different feedback, but the feedback was they were arrogant. We couldn't see ourselves working with them. Too aggressive, dealing with the wrong person. They didn't have a reason to change. That's another really, really good one. Sometimes we want to, we think, or we feel it's a compelling criteria, but often it isn't. Not aligned with the buying and the sales cycle, and that's something we're going to talk about a little bit more, Grant. So thank you for sharing that one. There's another interesting one here. Person at the client and myself didn't click. We didn't build a relationship. Now, this is a really, really interesting one, because so much of what we hear these days is, oh, well, it's not about relationship selling, it's about business to business. But actually, there's a whole host of different things where the decision, we get to the shortlist often with the customer's head. So with, rational decision criteria, facts and figures, features and functions. But so much of the getting from the shortlist to actually the final decision is about the heart. It's about EQ. It's about empathy. It's about creating connection and cultural fit. So the way I sum it up is it's almost more about people and purpose at that stage of the sales cycle than it is about product and price. Don't get me wrong, product and price is really, really important, but people and purpose is often what gets us from the shortlist to the final decision. Some excellent ones coming through here, and I might actually take a grab of this, and I'll share that when I send out the recording to everyone, because there's some really, really good feedback coming through here. I think the reality is, what that says to me is there's a ton of different reasons why deals go quiet. We won't manage to cover them all off today, but hopefully some of the strategies I'll give you over the next half an hour or so will help you as you start to do more and more of these, and maybe even help you with some sales cycles you're sitting on today that are that have gone quiet completely. So we'll talk about that in a moment as well. All right, so let's dive in. How can we stop deals going quiet? I see there's a little green squiggle here. I don't know where that green squiggle has come from, but I've obviously drawn it, so apologies for that. So here's my framework, and we'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to first of all just share the framework with you. So here's the framework that I've created. Let me just go back one. Here's the framework which I've created over the last couple of years, disseminating the conversations with all of these different customers and prospects. So the first one, and I don't know if it's the most important one, but it's definitely the first one, is is how critically important it is to answer the so what question. We'll dive into this in a second, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. The second one relates to actually getting the facts. Not making moves in a sales cycle based on assumptions or based on hearsay or based on gut feel necessarily, although gut feel can play a role, but actually getting really, really clear on the facts. The third one is about changing your language, and I'll share a story with you on that in a moment. The fourth one is about adding value. And I know adding value is one of those terms that's almost lost all meaning, like trusted advisor in the sales world. But that doesn't mean it isn't a real thing. It's become a sales truism or a sales cliche for a good reason. It's because it's actually incredibly important. So we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about it in the context of reciprocity. So people wanting or feeling obliged to reciprocate when we've added value. The fifth point is around aligning the sales process and the buying process. And someone actually alluded to that in the messages there a moment ago. The sixth point is changing your contact channel. And the seventh point is falling on your sword or qualifying out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to repeat those for those people who are dialing in and don't have access to their screens. So the first one, answer the so what question. Get the facts. Change your language. Add some value, brackets, reciprocity. Step number 5, align your sales process and your buying process with the customers. Align your sales process with the customer's buying process. Step number 6, change your contact channel. Step number 7, fall on your sword or qualify out. All right, so let's dive into that. We'll get into a little bit more detail. So step number 1, answer the so what question. What do I mean by that? Well, in my 20 odd years of B2B sales, I worked in a variety of organizations, mostly tech companies, mostly sort of tier 1 and tier 2 global organizations. One of those organizations, we did something that seems almost, quite strange or quite simplistic. When we were doing our dry run for an important presentation, we'd invite some other people who weren't involved in the deal into the room, and they'd all get a bit of card or a bit of paper, and they'd write the expression "so what" on the paper. And then they got to hold it up. They got to hold it up anytime we said something in our presentation without giving the context, where we were providing information in isolation or we weren't explaining why that was relevant to the customer. Now, you would think that maybe you do that 2 or 3 times in a presentation or in a conversation with a customer, but actually that sign was going up in the air time after time after time, because what happens is, for so many of us, the way we present becomes muscle memory, and we just go into presenter mode. We call it show up and throw up. And what that means is effectively we're going through the motions more often than we would care to admit. Customers can pick up on that. They can pick up on it in a heartbeat. And as a result, they start going through the motions as well. And as a result, if they have 3 or 4 or 5 vendor presentations, it's incredibly hard for them at the end of that process to actually differentiate between the different providers. So we hear the expression apples for apples all the time. They believe it's an apples for apples comparison between one and another. So how do we do that? How do we answer the so what question? Here's a quote from a CIO of a financial services company. And this quote effectively sums up why they didn't pick the vendor that we were there to talk to them about, why they didn't select that vendor. He said, they needed to link capability to usability to results. And unfortunately, they failed to do that. So what they did was they actually did a reasonable job on the capability and not too bad of a job on usability, but they absolutely failed to demonstrate how they had, delivered on this in the past. They didn't give any real context around customer success stories or who we've done this with before, or even projects that we've worked on that we've had some issues with and we've had some failures on, but this is what we've learned from it. This is how we've grown from it. So this is a critical step, and I would suggest that for the majority of you on this call, whether you're a salesperson or a sales leader, you fall into this trap. And I know that even though I understand this, I still fall into that trap of just kind of talking and providing information in isolation. So this is a really, really important one, and that might be why I almost unconsciously put it number 1 on the list. So let me just give you an example of this, right? We've got lots and lots of customers. Look at all their logos on the slide behind me. From a customer's perspective, so what? And I'm sure we've all been guilty of that, putting up 20 customer logos on a slide and thinking we've done our job. So I just like to propose a different way to think about this. I'd like to highlight 3 specific customers to talk about today. They had some similar business issues to you. These could be some good customers for you to have a chat to down the track. So what we're doing is, instead of putting up 20 logos, I'm putting up 3, but I'm giving really, really good context as to why I picked these 3, and then I'm connecting the dots as to how that's going to be relevant to you, Mr. Customer, down the track. It's a subtle change, but it's a really important one. We've won lots of awards for our projects over the years. If I'm a customer, I'm sitting there going, so what? Why do I care? So how do we reposition the same, effectively the same statement? We're incredibly proud of the awards we've won because we've won them in conjunction with our customers. Hopefully the project we're working on, could be one that gets put forward for an award at some point down the track. I think that's it's a small distinction, but absolutely, what we're talking about. And then the last one is, we have a very low employee attrition rate, or we have great great employee loyalty. Now that could be really, really relevant, but so what? So how do we reposition that? Well, look, our staff are really loyal. And why is that? It's because we're a great place to work, or we think so. But why should you care? Well, it gives you continuity in the team you're working with on this project, but it also means we've got really deep domain expertise in our business across all sorts of different areas because our people have been around so long and because they've learned so much. So you see what we're doing here? We're forcing ourselves to answer the so what question, which is a much, much better way to keep the deals we're working on alive. Okay, so that's lesson number one. What's lesson number two? This one might seem the most blindingly obvious, but let me give you some context on it. So get the facts. What do I mean? Well, is your contact, are they sick? Are they on holiday? Have they been fired? Have they passed away? I had a situation where I was calling someone back in my sales days, only to eventually get tired of calling them, and so I called through to the switchboard to discover that they passed away. Now, there's so much stuff happening on the customer side of the fence. A deal might be consuming 95% of our waking moments as we think about it, but it might be consuming 5% or less than on the customer side, because there's a whole lot of other stuff happening. Has there been a huge crisis inside their business? Have we made assumptions about the project that have now actually changed? Have they gone into a probity period or a quiet period? So it's kind of ironic. How do you stop a deal from going quiet if they go into a self-enforced quiet period? Are they feeling rushed? Are they feeling pressured? Literally a million and one things can happen, and a lot of those are legitimate reasons. So what we have to do is we have to put ourselves in the customer's shoes and admit that sometimes, just sometimes, there's a good reason why there may be no update, and that's okay. But we're going to explore some mechanism to test those assumptions and see if it is those things or if it's something else. But one of the things about getting the facts is that goes both ways. Here's another one from another quote from the CMO of a building company. What Paul said to us was, he said, what we're trying to do is a complex thing. More information makes people feel more comfortable. So this was on their side of the fence. His big issue was that they were trying to look at 4 different vendors as part of a decision-making process. 2 of those vendors had really, really good content, which they made available really easily. They didn't gate their content. They didn't require emails and follow-up phone calls and all that sort of thing. The other 2 made it really, really difficult to get access to their content. So this customer was trying to do their own research and due diligence, and 2 of the vendors unintentionally probably made it really hard for them to do that. And as a result, both of those vendors were knocked out before they even really got into the sales engagement. So this is a really important thing to think about. Customers want to get the facts themselves as well. Are we making them available to them easily? Is our content well optimized? Well, do we have good content? Do we have enough content? Is it well optimized for SEO? Is it easy to find? Is it engaging? Is it maybe fun or gamified? Is it are we really thinking about the person who's going to be consuming it, or are we just banging out white papers and thinking, well, we've ticked that box? It's really, really important. Your ability to create great content allows you to become a credible, knowledgeable expert in the eyes of your customer quite often before they ever engage with you. So this is a really, really important point. Step number 3. This one's an interesting one. It's changing your language. Now, by sheer coincidence, I had an example of this just this morning. So I was getting an email from a vendor, and I've had probably 3 or 4 of them now, saying, oh, we'd like to talk to you about our product. I think I was at a trade show or something, and I put my email address on a list, and as a result of getting all these emails, which I literally just disregarded. And then I got one this morning from the same person, but she had completely changed her language. It was much more human. It was much more sort of, it felt unscripted to me. And as a result, I responded very quickly. Now, the response I gave was, look, apologies, I haven't responded sooner. I am the right person, but no, we're not interested in this. Thanks for following up. But at least what that did for her was it closed it out, and it allowed her to sort of, close out the conversation with Trinity and move on to the next one. But the only reason I did that was because she changed her language. So So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about getting out of that just following up, just touching base, just closing the loop cycle that we find ourselves in. By changing our language a little bit, by creating a little bit more of a human connection, we increase the chance of them responding. It doesn't mean we increase the chance necessarily of a positive response, but at least we're more than likely to get a response. So let me drill into that a little bit. Would you be interested in versus would you be open to? Quite a subtle change there. I just wanted to follow up. I'd love to get some feedback from you on XYZ. Again, we're effectively asking for the same thing, but the language, I'd love to feedback rather than following up. It's, it's subtle, but these are the subtle cues that we as humans respond to. Let's talk about your business challenges versus can you help me understand why you made time to see me? Again, those two questions are kind of two sides of the same coin, but they're very, very differently structured. Somebody told me once, and I can't remember who it was, but it was a great insight, was you will be judged by the quality of the questions that you ask. So ask great questions. And also the thing about asking great questions is they tend to give you much more interesting answers. And as we go through that discovery process, the better the question, the better response, the better the insight, the better capacity we have now to deliver on an outcome for that customer. So I'd sum up this language piece this way: scripted, automated, unnatural versus tailored, relevant, natural. Which would you prefer? Because the reality is B2B, business to business, is a fallacy. People are selling to people, humans are selling to humans. We know what it's like to be on the receiving end of spam or automated emails or anything of that nature. So why, if we hated ourselves in our interactions, do we then allow ourselves to sort of, go down that path more often than we probably should? So here's an example. And as I say, this is recorded, so don't feel the need to take this down. But for those of you on the phone, I'll just read it out. So this is a how to avoid the just following up email. And this feeds into the next point as well. Hi, Mike. I came across this interesting article on cloud security trends, and I thought of you while I read it. I've attached it here. Hope you find it of interest. Look forward to discussing when we next connect. So what are we doing? We're still making contact. We're hopefully adding a bit of value because hopefully this article is relevant to the conversations we've had. So it's also a little bit personalized, a little bit tailored, and we're creating reciprocity, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about. So add some value, right? As I say, it's become a sales truism or a sales cliche, but that doesn't mean it isn't true. This chap here, I don't know how many of you, I look a bit weird in this photo. I don't know. I just given him a copy of my book. He just given me a copy of his book. Fascinating individual, a guy called Dr. Robert Cialdini. He's the author of a couple of New York Times best-selling books, one on the science of persuasion, and that one that I'm holding is on persuasion. Now, Dr. Cialdini, really, really interesting guy, and a lot of the research that he does is on the psychology of how humans interact, and specifically the psychology of decision-making. And so he's created his list of the 6 principles of persuasion. Now, I'd encourage you to take a note of his name, which is Cialdini, Cialdini, and then just head to YouTube and Google 6 principles of persuasion and watch that video. There's about a 10 or 11-minute video, which is just fascinating. The first principle of persuasion that Dr. Cialdini has uncovered is around that thing that I said, which is reciprocity. As he sums it up, it's people are obliged to give back to others the form of behavior, gift, or service that they've received. Now, that's a really, really interesting concept. And if you look at, some of the crime families of yesteryear, like, the mafia, that was often a strategy they used, giving something and then expecting something in return, maybe not immediately, but over time. Now, the caveat to all this is you have to do it in a way that's ethical, that's appropriate, that is, adheres to both your own internal policies and theirs. But that could be a white paper. It could be buying a book for $20 and sending it to them. It could be inviting them to an event because it's relevant. It could be any number of different things. We often make the mistake, in my experience, of believing that we're only going to add value at the end of the sales cycle. So you buy something from us, you use it or you implement it, and then you get value. But actually what we need to be doing, and the really best and brightest salespeople are doing, is they're finding ways, small and big, throughout the sales process to add value. And they're the ones that tend to get their phone calls answered. They're the ones that tend to get their emails responded to, because they're the ones that recognize just how important that is. I like this this kind of quote here. So we've all heard that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, value, just like beauty, is also in the eye of the beholder. And I think one of our key jobs as sales professionals is to understand, or to extract an understanding of what each customer constitutes as valuable. And I mean even the individuals inside the customer, because the more of that we know, the easier it is for us to add some value or deliver some value, and the greater the likelihood that we will trigger that human emotion, which is reciprocity, which is going to make them much, much more inclined to at least want to engage with us. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll win the business, but the other thing that I've learned over the last 7 years, as we've talked to hundreds and hundreds of C-suite decision makers and procurement people, and about why they made their decision-making process, is invariably we're not winning by 50% or losing. We're not 50% better. We're not 50% worse. It's actually 2% increments in a whole host of different areas. The quality of our tender response, the quality of our marketing content, how well we engaged at the beginning of the sales process, how well we did our dry runs before we did our presentation. A million little things often distinguish us between first place and second place, and one of those things is understanding what constitutes value in the eye of the customer and then finding a way to deliver that back. Okay, so we've gone through the first 4. We're now on to number 5, aligning sales process and buying process. Now, I'd like to tell you a little story here, and I don't know if this individual is on the call, but I won't name any names. But there was an individual who I was doing some work with an organization, and he said, look, I'm quite new to sales. I haven't been in sales before. I've actually come from the customer side of the fence. So I'm a little bit nervous and a little bit uncertain about the process. And I said, so, okay, what do you mean the process? And he was like, well, the sales process, the steps of the sales process. And I said, well, that's easy. We can, I can take you through that. He said, I completely understand the buying process, but not the sales process. So I stopped him and I said, well, that's really interesting, because I'm much more interested in the buying process than the sales process. So what we ended up doing was effectively, doing a bit of a mapping exercise. Here's everything that's happening, broadly speaking, on our side of the fence. So if I look at this, stages in a sales cycle. So lead generation activity, what are we doing from a thought leadership perspective? And, I'll let you read this yourselves as I talk to it. The discovery process, sales execution, negotiation, closing the sale, the win-loss analysis bit, or post-sales analysis, which I'm very, very passionate about. So, this is just a kind of a standard potential sales process. And, I think, we'll have different looks at different ways that could look, but broadly speaking, everyone on the call probably gets that. The bit that I find much more interesting is this next bit, which is the stages of the customer buying process. Identifying they've got a need, researching potential solutions, deciding to fix their pain, evaluating different solutions, all of those things. In my experience, one of the key things, if not the key thing, which slows down sales cycles and makes customers go quiet, is a misalignment between our sales process and their buying process. We're trying to force them to speed up to our pace. Right, we're trying to get them to step 3 when they're really only at step 1. Whereas actually, what we need to do is we need to meet them at whatever step they're at, and then we need to move forward together with them. Right, we need to be really, really clear about what it takes for them to move to the next step. Now, what this individual did, and I wish I'd instructed him or advised him to do that, but it was all his idea. Was he printed off the sales cycle and the buying cycle, and he takes it in and he sits down with a customer at the very start of the process and says, look, these are broadly speaking the steps that we tend to follow when we're working with a new customer. And these are many of the steps that we see our customers follow on their side. Can you just have a look at that? Have a look at the buying cycle, and does that marry up with what you're doing? And then they can annotate and scribble on that and say, no, we don't do that. We do this, et cetera, et cetera. And then have a look at our process. And does that make sense for you? Are you happy for us? So what they're doing is they're actually creating a common language and a shared understanding of the steps of the process, to the degree that that the sales guy can say, okay, well, we're at step 3. Looks like you're still at step 2. So why don't we hold here until you get what you need and you let me know what you need? Now, this seems really, really simple, but it's the first time that I ever came across that in my sales career. And I think it's a very, very important, whatever way you approach it, it's a very, very important step to consider, right? We think about, we talk about, we obsess about our sales cycle, our sales process all the time. But how much work have we put into really understanding our customers' buying cycle? And by work, I mean, have we written it down? Have we documented it? Could you hold it up and show it to someone? Could you hold it up and show it to a customer and ask them, does it actually align with what they're doing? Because in most other walks of life, this is what we would do. We would ask someone, oh, where are you up to? But we make all sorts of assumptions, inherent assumptions in sales. And I think that's a mistake, and it's a fundamental mistake. And if we can get out of that cycle of obsessively focusing on our sales process and actually start to look at, how do the two things marry up, and are we getting connection at the right steps, then the whole thing gets easier. The noise goes away, and everyone tends to be, a lot more comfortable. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the opportunity, but what it does do is dramatically diminish the number of deals that just disappear into the ether and go quiet on you because the customer feels awkward or pressured, or they feel they're being dragged kicking and screaming through a process that isn't their process. Okay, so if that was step 5, here's step 6. Now, this one I think has become more and more relevant, and is probably, day by day becoming even more relevant. There's a great book by a chap called Tony Hughes that some of you might know, which was released recently, a book called Combo Prospecting. And in Combo Prospecting, Tony Hughes discusses just how important it is to use a combination of communication channels to engage with a prospective customer. So, initial contact could be via LinkedIn, and then you follow up with a message and then an email or a phone call, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things which is happening increasingly, certainly in the B2C world, and it's creeping in more and more and more into our world, is that customers want to be communicated with the way they want to be communicated with. So it's not a one size fits all. Increasingly, I communicate with clients and prospects of mine via text message, via WhatsApp, certainly via LinkedIn Messenger, and via any number of other formats as well. We've got phone, email, WhatsApp, LinkedIn, Facebook, dropping into their office, text message, through a mutual contact. We could spend the next 20 minutes talking about different mechanisms to get in touch with our customers. And I think it's really important that, as Tony explains in his book, we take a combination approach to this. That's not just about prospecting, that's about all of the different things. We did a little research study recently, and we'll be publishing the report in the next couple of weeks on effectively the mood of the B2B buyer. So we went out and asked a huge number of C-suite people and procurement people a whole lot of questions about their engagements with the sales community. And some of their biggest frustrations are that they're getting communicated with in the wrong way. The frequency is too great, but also the communication channels are wrong for them. So I think this is a really important thing for us to be aware of, that we don't just, continue to send emails if we're not getting responses. I think there's a huge amount of creativity and imagination available to us as sales professionals, but quite often we sort of default to the standard mechanisms for whatever reason, and it turns our message vanilla, and actually it shouldn't be. So I'd encourage you to trial different mechanisms, and even just ask the question when you're talking to customers at the very start: what's the best way to get hold of you, or how would you like us to communicate with you? And you might find that the responses you get surprise you, because so often the responses we get surprise us. Okay, we're up to step number 7 now, and this is going to hopefully give us a little bit of time also for just for a couple of questions if we have any at the end. So I call this the fall on your sword or qualify out step in a sales engagement when a deal has gone quiet. And I don't want you to think that when I say qualify out, you're saying just simply walk away, because qualify out is a very valid strategy as part of your sales kit bag or arsenal. It isn't just a walk away strategy, and I'll explain that to you in a moment. But what I wanted to share first is this qualify out email. There's a chap called Brian Kreuzberger from HubSpot. And he did a huge amount of work testing qualify out emails with prospects all over the world. And this example that I'm going to share with you in a moment is the one that tested best. So I just want to show it to you, and then we can sort of break it down a little bit. So for those of you on the phone, I'll read it out to you. So he said, I'm writing to follow up my email and voicemail. We're in the process of closing files for the month. Typically, when I haven't heard back from someone, it means they're really busy or they aren't interested. If you aren't interested, do I have permission to close your file? If you're still interested, what do you recommend as the next step? Thanks for your help. Now, before we break this down, I just want to caveat this, right? So Brian, in his sort of writing on this topic, says he doesn't go straight to this qualified email. He might have had 3 or 4 contact attempts prior to this before he even comes up with any approach to qualify out, because it could be construed as aggressive, it could be construed as rude. So you really need to have got to a point. Also, the language he uses around closing out. So as he says here in his notes, no one really knows what that means, but it builds desire to open the email in the subject line. Then he talks about it's really important to tailor or customize the message to the communication history that you've had. but also it's about giving them an easy out. So not making them feel bad for not responding up until this point. And then also, as he says on point number 4, if you're still interested, what do you recommend as the next step? So he's tested a million different phrases, and for whatever reason, this one, because it gives the power back to the prospect, tends to outperform all of the other phrases he's used. And then finishes, thanks for your help, because just human to human, people like to help. Now, I think it's really, really important that we recognize that this isn't about brinkmanship. If you're going to send an email along the lines of qualifying out, and I worked with a client this week and we did exactly that for a very, very significant piece of business, probably the biggest piece of business that they would have closed in their history. But the prospect at the 11th hour brought in their procurement people, and the procurement people basically just created a whole lot of FUD that wasn't there, dug their heels in, and took a position. And so I helped this individual write a very appropriate, professional, qualify out email that says, unless we can do this, this, and this, which is what we'd already discussed and agreed, then we're out. So it's very, very important that you do this if and only if you're comfortable walking away. Now, I want to share one more email with you, or type of email with you, and I want to tell you a quick story on this as well. So I'll just talk to the point. So this is, I call this the fall on your sword technique. This isn't saying, please get back in touch with me. This isn't saying you now have permission to walk away. This is saying, I think I dropped the ball. I think I did something wrong, and I just want to apologize. And it has to come from the heart. This isn't a strategy or a tactic. You have to own this because you genuinely feel you did. So for those of you who are dialing in, I'll read it to you. Subject, apology. Dear Nick, hope you're well. I'm getting in touch with you not to move things forward, but simply to apologize. I think somewhere along the line, I might have dropped the ball, made you feel uncomfortable, or not properly answered one of your questions, which probably explains your recent radio silence. Please accept my sincere apologies, Nick. Kind regards, Cian. I ran a sales academy for a global sales organization last year. So in Europe, the US, Asia, Africa, so all over the world. And I talked about what to do when deals go quiet, and I talked about falling on your sword. And in 2 of those workshops, one in Barcelona and one in Berlin, if memory serves, 2 individuals came up and saw me at the break and explained that they had deals that had gone quiet, for periods of beyond 6 weeks, so 2 months plus. And so we talked about this particular strategy, and I helped them craft emails back to those customers. One was a French lady, and one was a German lady. And so obviously they did, the language and made sure it was appropriate. By the end of that same day in both of those workshops, both of those individuals had responses from the people who hadn't responded to them in a period of months. And one of them, the response she received was, basically the customer saying, you shouldn't apologize, I should apologize. I'm the one who should have got back in touch with you. Here's all the reasons why I didn't, and they were all valid reasons, but we absolutely do still intend to move forward with this project, and we do want to engage with you. Could you come and see me next week? So beyond her wildest expectation in terms of, and mine for that matter, but what she did was she changed her language. She didn't just go through the motions. She didn't ask for anything in return. It was from the heart. It was appropriate. And what it did was it created a human response on the other end. Okay. So we've got about just over 5 minutes to go. So what I'll do is just quickly recap those 7 steps, and then just give you a kind of a bit of a final thought on that, and then we might open up to some questions if we have any. So quick recap on that framework. And this isn't just about how do we get out of a position if we've got a customer that's gone quiet. It's how do we avoid getting into that position in the first place? Because that's a much better approach to take. It's not bring them back from the brink if they're already on the brink. It's how do we avoid them getting to the brink in the first place? So the first point is answer the so what question. Focus on this, not just in presentations, in tender responses, in any and all interactions you have. Don't go through the motions. Be really, really sure you've got the facts. It's very easy to go off, half-cocked and start making, assumptions. But we actually have to test that, and that's an ongoing process. The assumption testing process has to happen all the way through. Change your language. Find ways, big and small, to add some value, because what that does is it triggers that human emotion, which is reciprocity, and they're more inclined to want to reciprocate, add some value back to you. Align the sales process and the buying process is really, really important. If you get those 2 things married up, it's probably one of the single quickest ways to avoid deals going quiet in the first place. Change your contact channel. I've sat in forecast calls and had people say, no, I've sent them an email. I've sent them an email week after week. That isn't doing your job, saying I've sent them an email. You don't get to go home and pat yourself on the back if you send someone an email. There's a million different mechanisms to get in touch with people, and we need to use the appropriate ones in the appropriate circumstance. And then, this last one around falling on your sword and qualifying out. Now, please don't go away and start spamming your customers with fall on your sword or qualify out emails. But if there is an appropriate one, I'd encourage you to maybe to trial it and test it. Use your own language, personalize it, make sure it's tailored, and above all else, make sure it comes from the heart and it isn't, scripted or automated, because that defeats the whole purpose. So that's a quick recap on those, and then just a kind of a final point from my side on deals going quiet. I carried a sales bag for many, many years. I did all the different sales roles there are to do, from inside sales to sales management. So I know how tough a gig it is, but I also know that it's about preparation, it's about persistence, but it's also about patience, and it's also about people. And people just aren't always predictable. That's just the way it is. In the B2B world, they say sales cycles, go from anywhere from 7 to 10 interactions. I would contend it might be 20, 30, 40. So we don't step back after 2 or 3 interactions, but we try and use our creativity, and we try and take an approach that's more likely to drive an outcome. We often hear that sales is a numbers game. Sales is a numbers game as it pertains to hitting your quota and understanding what it takes to hit your quota. But it isn't a numbers game as it pertains to making people feel spammed or automated. That game has changed. I don't know if it was ever that, but it definitely isn't that anymore. If you throw mud against the wall and hope some of it sticks, you're going to get dirty hands and very, very few responses. It's all about earning the right to move to the next step. And the way you earn the right to move to the next step is by doing as best a job as you possibly can on this step. Don't focus on making a sale. Just focus on earning the right to move to the next step. Do it authentically. Do it with honesty. Customize your words. Customize your approach. No one likes templates, and the thing about templates is we often forget to, search and replace a name because it wasn't capitalized. And all of a sudden they know that all we're doing is replacing their name. And my advice, for what it's worth, is educate and inform the customers you work with. Don't sell, because actually by not selling, you increase your likelihood of making a sale. Folks, that's it. We're almost up to time. So what I want to do is just firstly thank you all for taking time out. I hope you've got some value from this. I hope you've maybe had a chance to have a coffee and just sit back and take some time out of your day. If you do have questions, now would be a good chance to ask them, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm going to stop the recording in a couple of minutes. For anyone who needs to drop off, feel free to drop off. But you will have responses to the questions as well. And yeah, I'll send an email in the next 24 to 48 hours with the copy of the recording, and also probably with one final question from my side, which is if you got some value from today, are there other topics you might like to have a chat about in the future? And I'll see if I can help out in that respect. But for those of you that need to drop off now, thank you so much for putting aside some time. As I say, I hope it was valuable. And for those of you that are happy to hang around for a couple of minutes, I'll go to questions and see if there's any questions. Alrighty, thank you. Lots of thanks coming in, and thank you guys. I really appreciate it. All of those thanks. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure, absolute pleasure, and I hope a couple of those things will strike a chord. Any questions? Any things that we didn't get to? Okay. Here's a question that's come in. In your experience, how applicable are those learnings across the Asia Pacific region, i.e. those values, are they applicable to the US, to EU, to Australia? What about Asia? Look, that's a great question. And I will caveat my response. So I have run workshop. I have worked in, spent a little bit of time. I haven't been based in Asia, but I have spent a bit of time working in Asia, and I have run these workshops. I think my response would be that, a lot of what we've talked about here is creating more human connection, and human connection transcends race and culture and anything else. But the caveat is that the language we use and the way we approach things is very, very different from one country to another. So particularly that qualify out email, I think, is one that would need to be done very, very differently in China or Singapore or Hong Kong, for example, and it would need to be done differently in South Africa. So what I would say is, for those of you who are dialing in from different countries, and I know we have people from across Asia and from the US and from Europe, that's about you trusting yourselves to know your environment and saying, okay, now how would I apply these strategies, these learnings in the context of my country, in the context of what's appropriate in my country, rather than, okay, let me just grab that wording. I have this philosophy that, we hire people into organizations, and sometimes we give them autonomy, and sometimes we micromanage them. But actually, we've hired them in because they have the skills that we think we need, or we think they need to be successful. So I would suggest that you trust yourselves, take some time to actually, trial some things, but don't feel the need to religiously adhere to anything I've put forward today, but just understand the concept behind it and maybe try and make that work for you. So I hope that answers your question. So I have another question here. We're an agricultural-based business. Our biggest challenge at the moment is the drought across Eastern Australia. We're looking for other areas to sell into, but it's really challenging our current business model. Do you have suggestions to help us continue to get sales in this situation? I do have a suggestion. I don't know if it's one you've considered up until this point, but what I would actually do is spend time talking to your existing customers and let them know that you support them and you care about them and you want to be there for them for the long haul. That obviously you're a commercial business. So do they have any ideas? Are there other ways that you could service their needs that you're not already doing? Or are there other adjacent industries or business opportunities that they could consider to allow you to stay, revenue positive and to stay productive until such time as they come back? And as a caveat to that, are there things that you could do in a bigger or small way to actually help them in their time of need as well? Because if you're just saying, well, look, you guys have no money, we're going to step away and we're going to make some money over here, that's not going to really strike a chord with too many people. But if you're able to say, look, we'd like your advice, we'd like your guidance on this, but we'd also like to find a way to support or give something back to you in your time of need, I think that potentially could open up some really interesting conversations. And I think as a broader response, what I would say is, we do not, as an industry, spend nearly enough time with our customers. And I don't mean doing a customer satisfaction survey or an NPS score. I'm talking about bringing them internally into our meetings. There's a great story about Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, and the fact that he has an empty chair in every meeting that he's in because he wants that chair to represent the customer, because he wants the customer to be at the heart of all the decisions that are being made. Now, I'd encourage you to go a step further and say, in important meetings, not necessarily for the whole meeting, but at least at some stage, bring a real life customer in there, one who's been around for a while, one that's trusted and loyal and you have a strong relationship with, and get their input, because there's a ton of golden nuggets that are sitting in customer land that we're just not accessing because we either don't realize they're there or we haven't got a mechanism to do it. So I hope that in some way helps you. Okay, I got another question here. We're working very closely with all of them, helping them to shift stocks. Okay, sorry, this is from the same individual. Yeah, look, that's great. And I think that's really the way to go. I'd encourage you to keep doing that, finding ways to help them, but actually, asking them for their help as well, because you'd be amazed at how much, how willing people are to help if we ask them that in the context of helping or advising, rather than in the context of, can we sell you something more? Folks, that seems to be all the questions that we have. Once again, just want to say a really big thank you to you all. I know it's hard to make time for these kind of things, but I hope it was valuable. And yeah, look forward to seeing more of you online in the future. And yeah, I just want to extend a big thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.